Welcome to lecture 7 of the course Mind and Brain. In the last lecture of the mind part, we'll take a look at problems concerning the scientific study of the mind. Is that even possible? In our historical overview of the mind-body debate, we have dismissed dualism, idealism, and behaviorism because those views either do not take science seriously or they don't take the mind seriously. Only the materialist theories take both the mind and science seriously. And we want a theory that takes the mind seriously, of course. It has to be a theory about the mind. And also we want to use our best method to gain knowledge about the world, in this case about how the mind fits in the physical world, and that's a scientific theory. And at least you have to take scientific reasoning and scientific data into account. So if science has found out that there's no reason to believe that dualism can be right, and we have a lot of evidence in favor of materialism, then clearly we should reject that. Now, the identity theory has the problem that the mind might be multiply realizable, but that's something that functionalism and connectionism can work with. So, since it's maybe that the mind is multiply realizable, we don't have conclusive evidence for that, then it could be that identity theory is still a viable option, right? And then you can combine either the identity theory or the improved version of functionalism, connectionism, with the embodied and embedded theory of the mind. So we can do that. We can even add, if there are some evidence and good reasons to do that, the extended mind hypothesis to that, but it looks like it makes the mind too large. Extending it out there in the world might be a bit overstretching the embodied and embeddedness of the mind. Now, when we have looked at all these examples that were given to support many of these materialist views, usually these examples, at least in the text and in the textbooks, are coming from people that are interested in the cognitive mind. They usually say it's about the mind in general, so about all the mental states, all the types of mental state we have distinguished, but usually the examples are about cognition only. And there might be a reason for that. There might be, it might be easier to solve problems concerning cognition than solving problems about qualia, the way things feel, what the qualitative aspects. So let's look at that and see whether it is actually possible. Ask this question, whether it's actually possible to study the mind in this same way, that is the conscious mind that has qualia, in the same way that we can study the conscious mind that has intentionality. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at some arguments of some philosophers that claim that there is a gap between a physicalist explanation and a description of our phenomenology. There is a problem between making the bridge between the physical world and the phenomenal world. And the question then is this something that's due to our cognitive capacities, or is this due to the world being in such a case that indeed it will be impossible to come up with a scientific, physicalist, materialist theory of phenomenal consciousness? So I'll first introduce the explanatory gap in general, then give 4 arguments that are claiming that there is such an explanatory gap. There are different arguments and different conclusions of how big this gap is, or how we should classify that gap. And we will evaluate that. The 4th argument, that the argument of Colin McGinn, requires for an evaluation an entire section. That's section 2, the natural method, that is a response to, it's Owen Flanagan's response to McGinn's argument that there is an explanatory gap. And that takes us to the conclusions of, well, this lecture and of the first part of this course, of the mind part of this course. So we have looked at the cognitive mind, the part of the conscious mind that is about something, that might not have qualia, that at least can be conceptually distinguished from phenomenal consciousness, the type of consciousness that we usually use the word consciousness for, the type of consciousness that is defined by having qualia. So we can study mental states that are about something. So we can study cognition, and we have seen that we go from functionalism to connectionism to connectionism in combination with the embodied and embedded theory of the mind, maybe even the extended mind hypothesis. So we have a kind of a progressive research program there. We find out more about how the cognitive mind fits in the physical world. But what about qualia? How does the phenomenal mind fit in the physical world? Can we find out, using the scientific method, an answer to that? Can we find an answer to that just as easily as we can find an answer to how the cognitive mind fits in the physical world? So can the problem of consciousness, in the sense of phenomenal consciousness, be solved? Or are there a priori arguments against that? We start by looking at what the explanatory gap in general is. That is, in general, in this debate about how qualia fit in the physical world. And then after that, we'll take a look at several arguments that purport to show that there is an explanatory gap. And then we'll also see how the different philosophers interpret this explanatory gap. The notion of the explanatory gap was introduced by Joseph Levine. And he says we are not able to explain the qualitative character of consciousness, so we cannot explain qualia, in physical terms. So it seems to work for cognitive states. We've seen that. We seem to be able to understand how they fit in the physical world. So we have a theory that takes the mind seriously, the cognitive mind seriously. So we have connectionism in combination with the embodied and embedded theory of the mind, and then we have at least a research program that is progressive, that provides us with new information. For instance, how representations are represented, how they are stored in a neural network. That's something new, and that seems to provide us with information about how the cognitive mind fits in the physical world, how cognitive states that are about something, that represent something, fit in the physical world. So we seem to be able to understand that. So we can understand the cognitive mind in physicalist terms. Now, is this also the case for qualia? Can we also fit them in the physical world in the way we have seen that for cognition? And Levine says, no, there seems to be a gap in our explanation. So we have an explanation of the physical world, of the brain, stuff like that. And then we also want to explain how qualia fit in that. And then we never seem to arrive at qualia when we talk about the physical world. And maybe that is due to some properties of the qualia. And he says, well, there is a gap in our theory between the physical world, between the explanation of the physical world and the explanation of the phenomenal world, of the phenomenal mind. Okay. And the question is, what type of gap is this explanatory gap, according to the philosophers that argue that there is an explanatory gap? There are two interpretations. One is that it is an epistemological gap, and the other that it is an epistemological gap because there is actually an ontological gap. So an epistemological gap means there is a gap in our knowledge. So qualia do fit in the physical world. Qualia are in some sense physical, but our theories are not able to explain that. But it actually is the case in the world. So it's just a gap in our theory and not in the world. An ontological gap, so ontology is the list of things that there are. So on is the old Greek for to be, so about the things that there are, or a theory about the things that there are. So it could be the case that what there is a world, that is a physical world, and that there are also qualia that indeed do not fit in that physical world. So we might end up with dualism again for qualia. Maybe not for cognitive states, but it might be the case for qualia. So if that's the case, then indeed, if you try to understand something that's not physical in terms of the material world, in physical terms, well, that will not work. And then, of course, because there is an ontological gap, there also is a gap in our knowledge. There is also an epistemological gap. So Levine says that it's an epistemological gap. So that means that physicalism, materialism might be the right view, but we just don't understand how it can be right. Some, Thomas Nagel, the later Frank Jackson, they do agree with him that it's an epistemological gap. And others disagree. Others, like the early Frank Jackson, say there is an epistemological gap because there actually is an ontological gap between the mind, the phenomenal mind, and the physical world. So let's take a look at these different arguments and evaluate those arguments and see whether indeed they are fatal to the endeavor to study the phenomenal mind from a materialist perspective, from a scientific materialist perspective. We will look at 4 arguments that claim that there is an epistemological problem. The arguments are different. The conclusion is always there is an epistemological problem, there's an epistemological gap. And of course, some of these arguments purport to show that there actually is an epistemological gap, epistemological problem, because there is an ontological gap. So let's first look at the argument of Thomas Nagel. Nagel's argument is often seen as an argument that should show that there is an epistemological gap because there is an ontological gap. But if you take a closer look, he only claims that there is an epistemological gap, and there might be an ontological gap, but there also might not be an ontological gap. So let's look at this argument and evaluate it. What's the problem? The problem is fairly easy to understand, and the question, of course, is whether it's fatal. So if we talk about phenomenal experiences, phenomenal consciousness, conscious experience, or how you want to phrase it, then it's clear that they are subjective. You feel what you feel, I feel what I feel, and I have no way of knowing what you feel. I expect that when you step into a nail, it's not pleasant, but just like Descartes says, you might experience chocolate and really not like that. Something like that. I don't know what you experience. So conscious experiences are subjective. You might have an inverted color spectrum, for instance. You will say that fire trucks are red, I will say that fire trucks are red, but if I had your experience, your mine, then we would conclude that we have inverted spectra. Now, of course, science aims for objective explanations. And that is a problem. So how can you explain something that is essentially subjective in objective terminology? That's basically the problem. This is what Nagel has to say about it. If the subjective character of experiences is fully comprehensible only from one point of view, that is your own point of view, you're the only one who knows what it is like to be you, and only a bat knows what it's like to be a bat, and only a chimpanzee knows what it's like to be a chimpanzee, then any shift to greater objectivity, so any attempt to think scientifically about this subjective character of experience that is only comprehensible or can only be understood from this one perspective, then any shift to greater objectivity gets us away from the specific viewpoint, that gets us away from your point of view, the bat's point of view, the chimpanzee's point of view. It does not take us nearer to the real nature of the phenomenon. It takes us further away from it. So if you have an objective theory about the subjective, you will leave out the subjective. So how can it be a theory about qualia? Qualia are subjective. How can you have an objective theory? How can you thus have a scientific theory? Because scientific theory is supposed to be objective. No idea how this works. Is this fatal, right? Now, Nagel clearly says that he doesn't know. He doesn't know whether physicalism is right. He just says, I don't understand how we can have an objective theory about the subjective. That doesn't mean that physicalism is false. He just doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how it could be true. How could we have physicalism as a scientific theory that objectively describes the physical world? How could it also describe subjective mental states? Because, well, they are subjective. How could they be physical? If it's physical, we should be able to describe it objectively. And that's not the case. And he says, well, that's no reason for despair, because compare this to the ancient Greek thinkers, the ancient Greek people. If someone would have told them that matter actually is energy, then they would not have the conceptual framework to understand that. But now we do, or at least some physicists do. So we can develop the conceptual framework to understand that matter is energy. And maybe we can thus also develop the conceptual framework. We need to understand how qualia fit in the physical world, how qualia are actually physical, how they are subjective, and how we can describe it in an objective way. So he says, there is some optimism. Maybe we'll close the explanatory gap in the future. Maybe there is not an ontological gap, it's just an epistemological gap, and maybe we are able to solve this. Is this a serious problem? No, this is not a serious problem. That is, we have a lot of work to do. We have to come up with a framework, how, according to Nagel, how to describe subjective experiences in objective terms. How are we going to do that? Well, that's of course is a problem because we haven't got that framework. So, well, be my guest and develop one. So we just have to wait and see. So this is clearly not an argument that's fatal for physicalism. It doesn't say it is impossible to do this, even though many interpret Nagel as saying that. But if you read the paper, paper's called "What's It Like to Be a Bat," then it's clear that that there is room for some optimism, and therefore for a kind of agnosticism with respect to physicalism. You say, well, if I don't know, I don't know. And then it might turn out to be an ontological gap, and it might turn out just to be an epistemological gap, and it might turn out we will never know. That also is, of course, a possibility that we never bridge the gap between the objective and the subjective, even though there is no ontological gap. Then there will remain this epistemological gap. So the first argument is at least not fatal to physicalism. It just says there's a lot of work to be done. Let's look at the second argument. This argument is by Frank Jackson and it's called the knowledge argument. So it has a name. It's called the knowledge argument. So on the exam, if I ask you explain the knowledge argument or something like that, it's this. It has happened before that I asked something about the knowledge argument and that students said, I don't know what it is, you didn't explain that. Jackson's argument is called the knowledge argument. And it's about Mary, the super scientist. Jackson says physicalism leaves something out. So he actually argues against physicalism. So if we say there is an epistemological gap, if we want to be physicalists, we don't get from the physical to the phenomenal, then Jackson says, yes, that's because the phenomenal is not physical. What does it leave out? Well, the subjective experiences, the qualia, phenomenal consciousness. And he's very clear about that. How does he argue? Let's look at that and then see that he indeed concludes that physicalism is false. So he argues that there is an epistemological gap, that the explanatory gap is an epistemological gap, because there is an ontological gap. The world is such that if you try to understand phenomenal consciousness in physicalistic terms, that will not work because phenomenal consciousness can't be understood that way because of phenomenal consciousness not being physical. How does he argue? He uses a thought experiment. So it's not a real experiment, it's a thought experiment. We think about a given situation, a possible scenario, or maybe an impossible scenario, doesn't matter. We think about the scenario and then see what conclusion we can derive from that. So the thought experiment is the following. There is this super scientist called Mary, and she lives in a black and white world, in a black and white room. Never mind how this, whether this is actually possible or not, how to prevent her from experiencing colors. But the idea is she is locked in a black and white room with only white, gray, and black, and she has no mirror. And she has no internet access other than to black and white pages or something like that. In some way, she is not able to, she's prevented from experiencing colors. She has the physiological makeup to do that, but she just has a world that's in black and white. And maybe she has contact lenses or something like that. So let's go with that. But she is a super scientist and she knows everything there is to know about colors. So it also is a scenario in the future when our scientific theory about colors, so the wavelengths and the rods and cones in your retina and V4 and how all that works, and we know everything there is to know about reflection of surfaces, light on surfaces. We know everything there is to know. So the theory about colors is finished. We know everything there is to know. That is, our physicalist theory is finished. It's done. There's nothing to discover anymore. So that's why Mary, the super scientist, lives also in the future. Okay. Now, she knows all that. She has studied that. So it's a physicalist theory. We can describe the physical world in objective terms. So you can write it down, you can learn that, she knows everything. So there's nothing more to learn. She knows all the physical facts. All the physical facts have been described in books. And well, maybe in the future, not in books, but on other devices, but it's been written down. All the objective physical facts have been described, and Mary knows all that. And then one day she's let out of the room, or she's given a color television, or these futuristic contact lenses that prevent her from experiencing colors are removed, and she now lives in a colorful world. And now she says, oh, so that's green, or that's yellow, or that's red. She sees a banana, and she says, oh yeah, so I know bananas are yellow, and I know everything about the surface of bananas and the wavelengths and all that, and what happens in my rods and cones and in V4, etc. I know all that, but I didn't know what it actually looked like, what it is like to experience yellow. Okay, this is a very strong intuition people have. I think many of you will agree. And now let's look at the conclusion that Jackson infers from this. He writes the following: if physicalism is true, she knows all there is to know. That is, if physicalism is true, and we have this futuristic theory about colors in which all the physical facts have been described in objective terms, okay, then all the physical facts have been described and she knows them, so there is nothing left to know. It seems, however, that Mary does not know all there is to know. There is something more to be learned to know about colors. For when she's led out of the black and white room or given a color television, she will learn what it is like to see something red, say, or yellow if she looks at a banana. Hence, physicalism is false. If you know all the physical facts and there's still something else to know, then those facts are not physical facts. They are phenomenal facts, right? And if the phenomenal facts are not physical facts, then the phenomenal world or the phenomenal experiences are not physical. Hence, physicalism is false. Clearly, this is an argument in favor of there being an ontological gap. And because there is an ontological gap, because the phenomenal is different from the physical, if you then try to understand the phenomenal in physical terms, well, yeah, obviously that's not going to work. Then you say, how does the physical phenomenal mind fit in the rest of the physical world? Well, yeah, that's becoming a pseudo problem, right? Because clearly the phenomenal world is not physical. The phenomenal experiences are not physical. Is this a serious problem? The idea that Mary learned something new is really strong. It's an intuition many people have. But there are several arguments against it. The first one from Edelman and Tononi also applies to Searle's argument that you can't understand the subjective in objective terms. And that is basically both Searle and Jackson ask something of a theory that we don't ask of any other theory. So it's a harsh demand. It's a demand that's too strong. So what is a scientific explanation supposed to do? So we're talking about an explanatory gap, a gap in our scientific explanation of consciousness, of phenomenal consciousness, of qualia. Now, if you look at any scientific explanation, they can provide the conditions that are necessary and sufficient for a phenomenon to take place. You describe the conditions that are necessary and sufficient, for instance, for a storm to be created. And we can explain the phenomenon's properties. We can explain what the properties of a storm are. And even we can explain why storms are caused by, well, different situations, but different conditions. So we even can explain why the phenomenon takes place under under those conditions. But no scientific description or explanation can substitute for the real thing. A theory about storms doesn't create a storm. So no scientific description or explanation, so a description of a storm or an explanation of how, under which conditions a storm is caused. It doesn't cause the real thing, the storm. So if I have a theory about colors, I could write a theory about colors in black and white. I could type it in black on white paper. And that, of course, does not cause you to have a color experience. It just describes what it is. It gives you the necessary and sufficient conditions. If the theory of colors and color experiences is totally finished, then it will do what Edelman and Zanoni say here. And of course, a description of the experience of yellow is not an experience of yellow. It's a description of it. And so if Nagel or Jackson said, well, we can't understand the subjective in objective terms. No, not if what you mean by understand is, I really want to know what it is like to be a bat. I really want to know what it is like to experience yellow, even though I am Mary in my black and white world. That's an unfair requirement of a theory about consciousness. A theory about consciousness does not constitute consciousness. A theory about what it's like to be a bat doesn't explain to you what it's like to be a bat in the sense that it gives you the experience of what it is like to be a bat. But Nagel himself tells you, well, a bat has echolocation, we don't, and therefore it is something it is like to be a bat, and we cannot know that. No. Indeed, we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, but you can describe in objective terms that all bats have echolocation. That's an objective fact about bats. You can do that. If you also want to know what it's like to be a bat, yeah, too bad. That's not going to happen. If you want to know what it's like to be me, you're never going to know that. Only I can know that because that requires the actual experience. So the demand is too strong. So that's one thing here. Of course, Mary is not going to know, based on reading in black and white, everything there is to know about color, what it is like to experience yellow, because then you need to have this experience. It doesn't constitute that fact. It doesn't constitute the experience of yellow. Just like a book about storms does not constitute storms. A book about nuclear war is likely not a nuclear war, but it can explain what it is. Right, so it's a demand that's too strong. But there are two other arguments against it, and they are related. The first one is by Daniel. So Daniel Dennett says, okay, Mary is let out of her black and white room, given a color TV, given a banana, and we've painted the banana blue. Now Jackson would say, Mary is given a banana. She knows everything there is to know about colors, etc. So she knows that bananas are yellow. So now she'll say, oh, so that's yellow. Now I know something more. Now I've learned something. And then Jackson says, well, that's a subjective fact. That's a phenomenal fact. It's not an objective fact, and hence it's not a physical fact, and hence physicalism is false. Daniel Dennett is a physicalist. He says, well, dear Frank Jackson, you don't take your own thought experiment seriously. If Mary really knows everything there is to know about colors, then she also knows what it's like to experience blue. And then you won't fool her with a blue banana. Then she says, yeah, that's a blue banana. Because she also knows, if she knows everything there is to know about colors, what it is like to experience all the different colors. That is the premise of the thought experiment. And if you then say, well, she learned something new when she sees a banana, yeah, then you're violating the very premise of your own thought experiment. And then it then says, well, I have the intuition that she then indeed will not be fooled by a blue banana. And then you'll see that this thought experiment basically is what Dennett calls an intuition pump. It is a story about Mary that is intended, that is meant for you, the reader, to get this intuition that indeed Mary learned something new, and that therefore physicalism has to be false because she knew all the objective physical facts. And then it says, well, that's just an intuition, and intuitions might be false. And that brings us to the later Jackson. Because Jackson later said, yes, this basically is an intuition. I had the intuition that Mary learned something new. But intuitions might be wrong. It's the world that determines what the world is like, not my intuitions. So whether phenomenal consciousness is physical or not physical does not depend on my intuitions. It is physical or it isn't. That's it. And my intuitions might be false. So I should not make conclusions based on my intuitions. So hence, it is possible that there is just the epistemological problem, that the explanatory gap is an epistemological gap and not an ontological gap. Based on my intuition, it could go on either way. My intuition tells me, oh yes, there is an ontological gap, but my intuition might be false. Phenomenal consciousness might be physical after all. I just have the wrong intuition. And we just saw Dennett. Dennett says, I think he's playing devil's advocate, but he says, I have the intuition that she's not being fooled by a blue banana because I have the intuition that she will, spot it because she knows everything there is about to know about colors. So is your intuition against mine? Intuitions do not determine what the world is like. So in the end, Jackson and Dennett did agree on the thought experiment and the conclusion that, well, the thought experiment doesn't tell you much. Jackson's argument was meant to show that physicalism was false, and he later argued that it was based on an intuition, that the argument was flawed. Let's look at another argument that's supposed to show that physicalism is false, and that's the argument of David Chalmers. Chalmers makes a distinction between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. And basically, it is what we have seen so far. We have seen that there are problems surrounding consciousness in this general sense that you say, well, we have phenomenal experiences, cognitive states, and emotions. That's all the conscious mind. And the problems that seem to be solvable by science are the ones that pertain to cognitive states. So we saw time and again that if we were talking about the mind, then we had a general theory like functionalism, and then the moment you go and give an actual example, that it's about cognition. And we saw that was similar with other perspectives on the mind-body relationship. So it seems that the scientific method can be used to solve problems surrounding cognition, surrounding learning, stuff like that. Chalmers calls that the easy problems of consciousness. And of course, those are really difficult problems and they're really complex problems, but they are easy in the sense that we can use the scientific method the way it is and use the assumptions we have about the world to find out how, well, cognition works. And there are also the hard problem, or there is the hard problem of consciousness, and that's the problem of qualia. How do qualia fit in the physical world? And he says, well, phenomenal consciousness basically isn't physical. So he also, just like the early Jackson, argues against physicalism. But he seems to be a physicalist, well, he is a physicalist with respect to cognition. So that is why, of course, he can work together with Andy Clark on this this extended mind hypothesis, because then you extend the mind with something physical like tattoos or a piece of paper or a notebook. So that is all compatible with physicalism. But his ideas about qualia, about phenomenal consciousness, really are dualistic, but not substantialism. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's first look at the way he argues in favor of this hard problem, the idea that the problem of how qualia fit in the physical world cannot be solved by contemporary scientific method, the scientific method and the scientific assumptions, and that we need to turn to some kind of dualism. He argues for the hard problem, he argues for dualism based on a thought experiment, and that's the thought experiment pertaining to zombies. And zombies are not Hollywood zombies. Hollywood zombies, you can immediately recognize them. Eyes falling off, and they walk really slowly, and they walk with their hands in front of them, and say stuff like, I need your brain, feed me, stuff like that. Now, a zombie is a physical duplicate of you, and the zombie acts exactly the same way that you do. So how does this work? So let's look at our universe. In our universe there is our planet, but let's look at the entire universe. Then imagine a giant copying machine that is able to copy our entire universe. But it copies only the physical stuff. So what it does, it creates a twin universe with in it, of course, twin Earth, and where there is an ocean on our planet, there is an ocean on twin Earth. So where there is a molecule on our Earth, there is a molecule on twin Earth. It makes an exact physical duplicate. The entire universe there has exactly the same physical properties as our universe does here. So that means that there is a desert near Tucson, or Tucson is in the desert, and wherever there's a grain of sand in the desert near Tucson, there is a grain of sand in the desert near Tucson on twin Earth. So it's an exact physical duplicate. So everything that happens here, if the sun is shining in Arizona, then the sun is shining in twin Arizona. And if there is a conference on consciousness in Tucson, and every year there is a conference on consciousness in Tucson, and Dave Chalmers is usually present there. So there is Dave Chalmers at the Tucson Conference on Consciousness. Then, of course, the same thing happens on Twin Earth. So there is a copy of David, a physical copy of David Chalmers visiting the Conference on Consciousness in Tucson, in Twin Tucson. And the same things happen, the same physical events happen. So if Dave Chalmers, the real one, says at this conference, if someone asks him about coffee, then he says, well, Ike's has the best coffee in Tucson. Well, if Dave says that, then the duplicate of Dave says that as well. He says exactly the same thing and at the same moment. Why does Dave say that? Dave Chalmers say that in our world? Well, we would presume that he has certain qualia when drinking the coffee of Ike's. But that explanation doesn't go for the copy because we have only copied the physical stuff. And now it is conceivable, we can imagine, that twin Dave has no qualia, has no phenomenal consciousness. Still, he says, Ike's has the best coffee in Tucson. So how can we explain that? Well, let's take a look how that might work. So he has a coffee, he takes a sip of coffee, that stimulates the nerve endings in his mouth. They send a signal to the brain. It's processed in the brain. Signals go to the motor cortex, and signals go from the motor cortex to the mouth again, and the mouth moves and says, Ike has the best coffee in Tucson. If you look at that explanation, then nowhere you need to involve a causal event that is an effect of something and the cause of the next, that involves phenomenal consciousness. You can explain zombie Dave's behavior in purely physical terms. So a physicalist theory could explain that. So and then you could say, well, he also knows that where Ike's is, for instance. So he has these cognitive states that are about the location of Ike's coffee shop. So he knows that, and the real Dave Chalmers also knows that. But the real Dave Chalmers also has qualia. But ask yourself, if you can explain zombie Dave's behavior without referring to qualia, and now turn it around and say, well, the real Dave Chalmers also is a physical organism, and you can explain his behavior in exactly the same way. He does do exactly the same thing. So you don't need to postulate qualia. You don't need to postulate phenomenal consciousness to explain why he says Ike's has the best coffee in Tucson. It is the same explanation we have for the behavior of the zombie twin. So that means that it seems that qualia, phenomenal consciousness, cannot be functionally analyzed, cannot be given a causal role analysis. It doesn't do anything. And if it doesn't do anything, then how is a physicalist theory ever going to explain that? So it seems that we need to, well, think out of the box here. So the idea is zombies show that there is a hard problem, that if we look at the scientific method we have available to us, that assumes that anything that exists can be analyzed functionally, can be analyzed causally, and that is exactly what we saw that was going on in identity theory and functionalism was improved by connectionism. So there also is a causal role analysis. There's input going in, there is the input going through the system. Those are all causal relations. So there is the feedback loop, for instance, that is cause and effect again, and there is output also, the effect of the information processing inside the connectionist network. So in order to be able to explain something, it has to have causal powers. It has to be able to be causally analyzed, to be functionally analyzed. And qualia seem to fall outside the realm of things that you can analyze functionally. So cognitive states can be analyzed functionally, and qualia don't. So now if you look back at functionalism and say, okay, functionalism is meant to be a theory about the entire mind, all the mental types we distinguished at the beginning of this course, and then when they have to provide an example of how this actually works, functionalists only talk about cognitive states. And Chalmers basically gives us the reason why. Because qualia seem not to be functionally, causally analyzable. And you need that for a functionalist theory about any mental state, or an identity theory about mental states. So it seems that qualia fall outside the realm of this functional analysis, and that makes them so problematic to fit them in the physical world. That is why it is a hard problem. So if science only can work with those things that have causal, that are effects and can be causes, and qualia seem not to be those type of things, then contemporary science cannot solve this problem of how to fit the qualia in the physical world, while it can solve the problem of how conscious states, cognitive states function, work, and how they fit in the physical world. Is this a serious problem? John says it's not a problem if we think differently about phenomenal consciousness. Usually, in a physicalist theory, in a materialist theory, we think that all mental states supervene on brain states or on other physical states, and that means that mental states are either identified with certain brain states or are realized by those brain states. And Chalmers says that's wrong. What you need to do is you have to understand that consciousness is fundamental. So that's his solution. So we have a physical universe, and in this physical universe, it's not that strange, not that odd to postulate by physicists that there are fundamental properties, fundamental building blocks of our universe, whatever they may be. And in our universe, contrary to the zombie universe, there are also phenomenal building blocks. Phenomenal, fundamental particles, if you want. And that means that he says things like, okay, so there is a kind of supervenience, a kind of dependence relation between the phenomenal and the physical. That is, if you can't have a purely mental world, he says, because there are laws in our universe that are absent in the zombie universe that basically determine that wherever there is something physical going on, there's also something phenomenal going on, and these laws are absent in the zombie universe, and therefore there is nothing phenomenal going on if there is something physically going on. So if there is something physical going on in my brain, I take a sip of coffee, signals go to my brain, and these signals make a difference. So there's information processing, and information is a difference that makes a difference in information theory. So that's what Chalmers uses. He says, well, if there is a difference that makes a difference, if there's information, if there's physical information, then here in our universe there is a law that makes it so that there is also phenomenal information made out of these phenomenal building blocks, you could say. So if I take a sip of coffee, then I have these qualia, I have this what's it likeness, because there is this law that makes sure that there is this phenomenal thing going on. But it doesn't have any effect on the physical world. Everything that happens in the physical world can be explained in purely physical terms, just in the way it can be explained in the physical universe without these laws, without these fundamental building blocks, without the qualia. So whatever physically happens in our universe happens in the zombie universe, and here we have laws that say if something physically is going on, something physical is going on, something phenomenal is going on as well. And that then depends on the physical world. So it is also a kind of supervenience, he calls it natural supervenience, which is different from the type of supervenience we saw in the identity theory and functionalism and connectionism. So it's not, so the natural supervenience is not to be interpreted as identity or realization, just as determination via extra laws. Now, this means, for instance, that if you accept this and you say information is a physical difference that makes a difference, if we're talking about the physical universe, and that wherever there is physical information, there is phenomenal information, that's a law that specifies that. So wherever there is something physically going on, there is something phenomenally going on. So then you say, okay, it might make sense to you if we're talking about a brain or an artificial brain. So that's an artificial computer in a body could have consciousness here, but the same copy of that computer in a robot in a body in the zombie world does not have phenomenal consciousness. But it also means that if you have a clock and the hands of the clock are moving, that's a physical process, that's physical information, that actually is information for us. If we want to know what the time it is and the clock is working properly, then you get indeed information, and then it makes a difference where the hands of the clock are. So it's a difference that makes it make a difference. There's physical information. Okay, but then there's also phenomenal information in our universe if you look at the clock, and not if I just look at the clock, but wherever the clock is well, working and moving, making changes in the physical world. So that means that it is something it is like to be a clock. Right. So we have this zombie thought experiment in favor of the idea that qualia provide us with the hard problem of consciousness because they can be causally, functionally analyzed. The solution to that problem is, well, to change our scientific assumptions. We have to assume that consciousness is in some sense fundamental, but also dependent on the physical world via some additional laws that are present in our universe and not in the zombie universe. And one of the consequences is that clocks are conscious. Clocks have phenomenal consciousness. And then John Searle, we saw him in in debate with the functionalists when he presented the Chinese room argument, says, okay, it's okay to bite the occasional bullet. If you have a theory about something and it has some odd consequence, then it's okay to say, yes, that's a consequence I am happy to accept. So it's okay to bite the occasional bullet, but he says Chalmers swallows an entire arsenal, meaning that there are so many problems with this theory, that there are so many strange consequences that go against everything we know, that, well, the theory cannot be seriously accepted. So let's take a look. He is a dualist. He is not a substance dualist, he's a property dualist, you could say, in some sense. So there are fundamental phenomenal properties in our universe that in some sense depend on the physical world. So you can't have a world that's just mental, that's just phenomenal, I should say. So the phenomenal world, if it's present, depends on the physical universe, the physical world. And then of course then is the question, how do they interact? Because if qualia don't do anything, if phenomenal consciousness cannot be causally analyzed, cannot be functionally analyzed, it apparently doesn't do anything. But if I take a sip of coffee, I have these really pleasant qualia, and these qualia seem to be the cause of my utterance, my sentence, me saying I have this really pleasant qualia. That's wrong, because the zombie Hans says the same thing. So the utterance I have this really pleasant qualia is not caused by the qualia. It's caused by brain states on which, in our universe, the qualia supervene, but not in the identity or realization sense, but they just determine it because there are some laws that specify that wherever there's physical information, here there's also phenomenal information. So there is this problem of the interaction problem. How do I know? So that's a problem, of course. How do I know that I have qualia? You don't. Also, it's anti-evolutionary. Like all dualists, he has that problem. So we can't go into this right now, but I think it does make sense that if you have an experience of something painful, that is a very good indication that something is wrong with your body. So you stepped into something sharp. So you're walking on the savannah and you step into a sharp rock. It's really good that you feel this pain, because then you attend to the wound and might try to stop the bleeding, get rid of the sharp stone or something like that. You attend to the wound and you try to prevent worse. And on the other end, things that taste good probably are good for you. And things that taste bad don't. They probably contain bacteria or something like that, or poison. So if something smells odd, don't eat it. But if something smells good and tastes good, then it's probably good for you. So it seems that qualia do have an evolutionary function, and well, I think we could make a really strong case for that. But the zombie also evolved because the physical processes in that world were exactly the same as in our world. So it's an anti-evolutionary approach to phenomenal consciousness. Consciousness doesn't do anything, so it can't be selected for by evolution via natural selection. And I think that's totally at odds with what we know about evolution of the mind. Well, it also amounts to epiphenomenalism. Basically, it says, well, epiphenomenon means a phenomena, something existing, an entity that exists above something. It floats on something but doesn't do anything. So phenomenal consciousness becomes an epiphenomenon. It's there, but it doesn't do anything. So how is it relevant? And Thomas tried to say, well, it is relevant. It is relevant because if I say I have these really good qualia if I drink coffee from Ike's, and the zombie does say the same thing, then my sentence is true. But the sentence of the zombie isn't. Because the zombie doesn't have qualia, and I do. So that means that there is some relevance. However, this brings us back to the interaction problem. How do I know this? Because my qualia don't do anything. And Zombie Hans is at the same moment recording the same movie in the zombie world, claiming he's not a zombie. I claim I'm not a zombie. If I drink coffee, I have qualia. The zombie makes the same things because those are physical utterances in a physical world. But the zombie doesn't have qualia. But he's convinced he has. The only difference is that the zombie is wrong. But he can't establish that he is wrong. And the zombie will never say something strange like, or will never notice that he says something strange like, I really like these qualia. Wait a minute, I don't experience qualia. He doesn't have the experience, and I do. But the zombie is at the same moment saying exactly the same thing. But if you have a cognitive mind, and you'll say things like, I have these nice qualia, then you probably notice that you're lying, or at least you're telling something that's not true. That's a cognitive conclusion. So why doesn't the zombie do that? Well, of course, because of the physical laws. But, well, you see how all this is and how it goes against everything we know. So panpsychism, that we already talked about, but this is the word for it, panpsychism. Pan means everything. So everything has a psyche. Even a clock has consciousness. But also your stomach has consciousness, right? Because there are physical processes going on in your stomach. You don't know. You don't have access to what's going on there consciously. And even cognitively, you have no, well, you know it, but you know not exactly what's going on. So if there is a physical difference that makes a difference going on in your stomach, and there is, then there is physical information, and then there is also phenomenal information. So there is a psyche of your stomach and of your bowels and, well, whatever. That's really strange. And that also brings us back to the evolutionary point of view. Why would there be a universe, our universe, in which a stomach has consciousness, in which a clock has consciousness, has phenomenal consciousness? It is something, it is like to be your stomach. Or your left toe, your left big toe, whatever. So this is what basically what Searle alludes to when he says it's okay to bite the occasional bullet. So if you would only have well, panpsychism, you might say, okay, I have panpsychism, but still phenomenal consciousness is physical, but a clock has it as well. Then you might say, well, that's the consequence of my theory. I'm happy to accept. But if you also have to accept that it's anti-evolutionary, well, we have reasons to believe that it isn't, that it is dualist, while we have good reasons to think that dualism really is false, then you might say, well, this solution to the hard problem generates more problems than it solves. So it's problem, and it goes against things we already know. But of course, Chalmers would argue, yeah, that is the upshot of my proposal. One real big problem, of course, is that Chalmers needs to show how he gets from conceivability to possibility. I can think, I can imagine a lot of things, but are they really possible? I can imagine the zombie world, yeah, no problem. So it's conceivable, but is it also possible? And Chalmers says, well, I don't see a conceptual contradiction in the concept of a zombie, and therefore it's possible. I think it's possible, and now you have to show that it isn't. Well, that's not how it works. First, you need to show me the evidence. If you believe something, I can believe anything, but it could be just because I am ignorant, and that might be the case here. We don't have a solution to this question, how qualia fit in the physical world, and then anything becomes conceivable because you don't have knowledge. If you don't have knowledge about what a square is and what a circle is, you say, I don't see a conceptual contradiction in a square circle. Yeah, that's because you're ignorant. Show me the evidence that it is possible once you have a proper concept of these two things. So you need to have more than say, I don't see a conceptual contradiction in the concept of a zombie, and therefore it is possible. Well, that's not a convincing argument. You need more. So the total argument, so it's not only that he swallows the entire arsenal, but he also needs to provide a really good argument to show that the conceivability of zombies entails the possibility of zombies. And that's more than just saying, I don't see the conceptual contradiction, because there might be a conceptual contradiction if you had more elaborate concepts. And we seem to have them. Qualia seem to do something, for instance. And then you say, well, I don't see how it's possible, because then in a zombie world, there is something lacking that does have causal effects here, and then the zombie world can't be an exact physical duplicate, because at the moment the zombie realizes, he says, I have qualia, but doesn't, then he will say, oh, that's odd, I'm making a claim about something I don't know whether it exists or not. Certainly I don't have qualia. So this is a really problematic view on phenomenal consciousness. We've seen three arguments now: how to think about the explanatory gap. You might argue that there is an explanatory gap, but so far we haven't encountered an argument that actually shows that the gap can't be closed, that it's impossible to find an answer to the question how qualia fit in the physical world. Let's take a look at yet another argument, the argument of Colin McGinn. It's an argument about cognitive closure. Cognitive closure means that we have no cognitive access, we cannot have knowledge about, in this case, the solution to this problem of how qualia fit in the physical world. And when we evaluate this, we go to a next section, because I think the answer to Colin McGinn's challenge deserves an entire new section, and it points us in the direction of how to think about this question of how qualia fit in the physical world. We saw that Nagel was kind of optimistic. He says, okay, if you would have told some ancient Greek that matter actually is energy, they would not have understood that, because they didn't have the concepts to bring together matter and energy. And then you say, I don't get this. How can matter be energy? Well, you need the concepts to understand a claim like that. And we might develop them, and we did do that for the claim matter is energy, and we haven't done so yet for the claims that the mind supervenes on the brain or on the physical world in the sense of the identity theory or functionalism and connectionism. And so Nagel says, let's wait and see. Maybe it is possible in the end to come up with a solution. Colin McGinn is more pessimistic. He says, okay, I do believe that the mind, the phenomenal mind, fits in the physical world the way physicalism says, so that some type of physicalism is correct. But, he says, we are simply not smart enough to understand that. It's like a chimpanzee trying to understand quantum physics. So he's not comparing us to ancient Greek thinkers that don't have the concepts yet. He says we are like chimpanzees that cannot develop the concepts. If a chimpanzee will not ever develop the concept of you need to understand quantum physics. So basically he says we aren't smart enough to understand the relation between consciousness and the physical world. We are cognitively closed. And that's a nice way of saying we are too stupid. To say that you're cognitively closed to the solution to a certain problem just means you don't have the cognitive capacities to solve this problem. So a chimpanzee is cognitively closed to any problem concerning quantum physics. We are cognitively closed to the solution of the qualia problem. And he argues for that by showing that there are two possible ways to solve the problem, and neither of them will actually solve the problem. So there is introspection. So the idea is, okay, so physicalism probably is right. He agrees with that, but we just don't understand that. We're too stupid. We're cognitively closed. There are two ways. One is introspection, and the other is neuroscience to actually get to know that mental states supervene on certain brain states. So we have introspection. That is, we close our eyes, we think about thinking, about experiences, about emotions, and then is there any point in our thinking, in our introspection, that we arrive at and say, now here I need to introduce some physical concepts referring to physical stuff like the brain. Do I know, if I close my eyes, that if I have an experience of purple, that V4 is active in a certain way? No, I'll never have to do that. I'll never get there. Otherwise, Aristotle would have already done that. Aristotle was able to introspect his own mind. If introspection leads you to the supervenience base of your thoughts and emotions and your experiences, then surely someone as smart as Aristotle would have found this supervenience base. He would have found, oh, it's this and this activity in V4. He would have known everything about neurons. Well, he didn't. So introspection clearly doesn't bridge the gap between the phenomenal and the physical. And the other way around, if you take a look at neuroscience, if you say, okay, so here we have a brain, and you're a neuroscientist, so you put somebody in a scanner and see what the brain looks like, or you operate on someone and get the top of the head open, and you look at it, and well, if you put someone in a scanner, or you do an operation like that, and you wake someone up from the anesthetics and you give them chocolate, then you say, oh yes, sure, here's the experience of chocolate, or on a scan, you say, oh yes, there's the experience of chocolate. And he says, well, no, you don't. So if you look at the physical world, you don't need to introduce concepts referring to the phenomenal experiences. So when we just have these two methods, either introspection or neuroscience, and neither of them will take you from one domain to the other. Introspection starts in the domain of the phenomenal, and you'll never need to introduce physical concepts, so you'll never close the explanatory gap in that way. And neuroscience starts in the physical domain, and you never need to introduce phenomenal concepts referring to the phenomenal mind. So that method also will not close the explanatory gap. So we have this explanatory gap. It's an epistemological gap. Well, you might think that physicalism is right, but we can never know it's right. So we can't solve this problem. We are not smart enough. Is this a serious problem? The last argument, we'll call him again, against the possibility of studying the phenomenal mind scientifically, finding an answer to how the phenomenal mind fits in the natural world, requires a separate section. So I think Owen Flanagan's argument that introduces the natural method is indeed a good answer to that question, but also takes us really to the study of the brain. So let's take a look at that. McGinn says, in order to understand the mind-body relationship, especially when we're talking about the relationship between the phenomenal world, the phenomenal experiences, and the physical world, the brain, we have just two ways of getting there, either via introspection or via neuroscience. And in neither case, we need to introduce the concepts of the other domain. Introspection starts with doing research, you could say, in the domain of the phenomenal mind, and then you never have to introduce physical concepts pertaining to physical stuff like brains or artificial brains. So we'll never bridge the gap, we'll never close the gap. And on the other hand, if you start with neuroscience, if you start with doing research into the brain, you'll never have to introduce concepts referring to phenomenal experiences. You never say, oh yes, here is the experience of chocolate. So we are cognitively closed, we just have two methods, and neither method will solve this problem for us. Answer the question how qualia fit in the physical world. We will not find an answer to that because we're simply too stupid. We're not smart enough. Now, Owen Flanagan says, if you have these two methods, the combination might solve our problem. If you use introspection in isolation, you'll never close the gap. If you use neuroscience in isolation, you'll never close the gap. But we might close the gap if you combine these two methods. So how does this work? Well, he calls this the natural method, and let's see what he has to say about that, and then go to an example, and then we'll see that it actually might work. And that we then does need to look more at the brain. We need to know more about the brain. He says, start by treating 3 lines of analysis with equal respect. Give phenomenology its due. So listen to what people say about what they experience, what their qualia, what's it likeness. So he takes the mind seriously, he takes qualia seriously, says they exist, and people can report on them. So we take phenomenology seriously, we take introspection seriously. That's where we start with. And then you take science seriously. And of course, we're talking about the science of the mind. So we're looking at psychology and neuroscience. Psychology and cognitive science. And of course, it's also the science of the brain. So we also look at neuroscience. So let's look at that. And we don't do that in isolation. You don't look at either introspection, either phenomenology, or psychology and cognitive science, or at neuroscience. No, you look what the fit is between these stories. How do they go together? So you look at introspection and psychology, or introspection and cognitive science, or introspection and psychology and neuroscience. So that's what you do. And he calls this the natural method. And we can depict that natural method as follows. So we have phenomenology, and it works in combination with neuroscience. Of course, you can look at phenomenology in isolation, but and then you might learn something about phenomenology. You might learn something about your own experiences. But McGinn already has shown that, well, you will never have to introduce concepts referring to the supervenience base of your phenomenology. Okay, so, but you can look at neuroscience and look at it in isolation, and you learn a lot about the brain, of course, but you might not learn anything about phenomenology, or how qualia are realized, or how they are identical to certain brain states, for instance. But in combination, you might find out things. You could also use, of course, psychology and cognitive science, and that's not the end of it. So you can also use philosophy, biology, psychiatry, anthropology, sociology. Those sciences also have, of course, something to say, and so these are sciences that Flanagan mentions. But of course, chemistry, physics, and biology, any science, evolutionary biology, any science that has something to say about consciousness can be used in a natural method. So what you do is you take an interdisciplinary approach. Flanagan doesn't claim any originality here. He just says that is how you can solve the problem, because it's not a problem of one domain. So if you look at biology or evolutionary biology, then you might be able to find out what the function of consciousness is. And that would then show that Dave Chalmers really has a problem, because he would say that qualia don't have a function. They don't do anything, so they can't be functionally analyzed, so they don't have an evolutionary function. And if they have a function, it's probably an evolutionary function. So this is, in a nutshell, what the natural method is. You take an interdisciplinary approach, including phenomenology, including introspection, to try to solve mind-body problems, including those about qualia, how things feel, and how these feelings fit, that have this phenomenology, that have this what's it like this, fit in the physical world. So let's look at an example. Jeroen is going to tell a lot more about the brain, but there is this famous example, you probably have heard of it, the Penfield homunculus. A homunculus is a little person inside your head, and in older times, the story goes, is that in order to understand how you can understand something, you get input and it goes into your head. And how can you understand what I'm saying? That goes input through your ears. Well, there is a little person in your head, and this person understands what's going on. And that's a homunculus. And of course, the homunculus has a homunculus in its head, etc., etc., etc. So, but there actually are homunculi in your head, in the sense that there are representations of your body in your brain, on your brain. So, and Penfield is the scientist that discovered them. And basically, he used the natural method. He used introspection, reporting about phenomenology, in combination with neuroscience. So what he did was, well, if you have to operate on someone as a neuroscientist, because there's a tumor in the brain, then you give someone anesthetics. So the person goes to sleep, and then, well, you cut off the top of the skull, basically, and then you have access to the brain, and you might be able to see the tumor already, but you want to be very careful with what you cut out. And what you could do then is to wake this person up. It's kind of a horror story, but that's what they're still doing when they are operating on people, not on everyone, but they can do that. And then you can use an electrode, so a device with a little bit of electricity, and you put it on the brain. And you stimulate the brain, not via, for instance, touching the hand. If a scientist would touch your hand, then there's a signal going on, going from your hand to your brain. And then of course there's a brain process. But you could also just put some electricity to the brain directly, and then you could ask the person, what he or she experiences. And then he found out that people said, well, you're touching my thumb, you're touching my face, my back. So he found a representation of the body on the brain. And he could only have found that it feels like you're touching my thumb. Is what's its likeness? He could only have found that if he used neuroscience, investigation of the brain, in combination with phenomenology. If he would not have woken this person up, he would not be able to ask, well, what do you experience? Then he never would have found it. He said, well, it's a piece of brain. Just like all the other pieces of brain, I just cut it out because, well, I need to get to that tumor. I cut that out. No, you would like to leave that and maybe go in another way to the tumor. So it's really practical problem, of course, but he basically applied the natural method. He applied, in this case, the natural method in a way that he asks persons about their phenomenology when he directly investigates the brain, puts some electrode on different parts of the cortex, the outer layer of the brain. And then he found that there is this representation of the body on the cortex. There is this little homunculus. It's not the homunculus in the older sense that it is an actual person, but it is a representation of your body on your cortex. And now you have found the areas, well, that are active when you feel something. That is, when you feel touch. So if you do this, then your hands feel the other hand, and then these areas are active that represent the hand, these areas of the homunculus. And that means that we found a correlation between phenomenal experiences and brain activity. And then, well, you could go about like the identity theorists, for instance, and say, well, how do we explain this correlation? But you'll only find this correlation if you use the natural method, if you use these methods in combination, and see how they fit together, and not if you just look at introspection, just look at phenomenology, or at neuroscience, or at biology, or at psychology, or at cognitive science. If you do that all in isolation, you will not answer the question, how qualia fit in the physical world? But here we have a reason to believe that if you combine them, you'll end up with information like this, with knowledge like this. And that will eventually, we hope, actually give us insight in how the phenomenal mind fits in the physical world. I think it's safe to say that all these arguments of these philosophers that purport to show that it's impossible, or at least highly problematic, to study qualia in this scientific way in accordance with physicalism or materialism, though all those arguments don't work. So we could go ahead. So Nagel's argument is clearly not fatal. That's basically what he says himself. Jackson's argument is too demanding, and later Jackson says it's based on intuition, and that's never a good guide to real knowledge. Chalmers' argument clearly is not convincing. His solution for his own the problem he creates himself creates so many more problems than it solves that you say, well, that's really becoming implausible. And McGinn's argument is too naive. We have the natural method. If you have introspection, if you have scientific studies, scientific methods, you can combine them. And then you'll be able, then we hopefully also able to determine in the end how the qualia fit in the physical world. Let's briefly look at the conclusions of the first half of this course, the conclusions of the mind part of this course. So the general problem we had is, how does the conscious mind fit in the physical world? And then we saw that there were 3 types of mental state that we could distinguish on when talking about the conscious mind. So then we asked the question, can the mind function separately from the brain? In other words, is substance dualism a viable position? Is that something we should adhere to, we could defend? Well, clearly not, because scientific data point away from this separability thesis, the thesis that the mind and brain can exist and function in absence of each other. We looked at idealism, that claims that there is only mind, that is, only the mind is a substance, and then we saw that the argument in favor of that was based on really bad reasoning, bad logic, so also not a view we should accept. A view that started by looking at science using the scientific method, that was behaviorism. It tried to reduce, to show that the mind is nothing more than behavior. Well, clearly it leaves out of the theory what it is all about. That is, if you only talk about behavior, you're not talking really about the internal subjective mental states. So you leave those out, you leave the qualia out, you leave the qualitative aspect out, at least, and also basically the representational aspect. So then we looked at the identity theory. Is the mind part of the brain? Well, yeah, that's a view that took the mind seriously, took science seriously, but the only problem there is that the mind looks to be multiply realizable, but that is not, that's just something that is intuitively plausible. It could be that that's not the case, and then identity theory could still be unacceptable, or it could even be true, right? So, but if you think that the mind is multi-realizable, then we've looked at functionalism and its improvement, connectionism, and then you say, okay, yeah, so that seems to work. Connectionism is a more fruitful approach than functionalism because it's biologically more realistic, and we can also combine that, and also the identity theory, we could combine that with the embedded and embodied theory of the mind. So at least for intentionality, that seems to work. The question is, does that also work for qualia? So if we're talking about intentionality, should we accept parts of the body, parts of the environment as actual parts of the cognitive mind? That's what the extended mind hypothesis was. There are some arguments in favor, there are some arguments against. I would say it's still a hypothesis, the jury's still out. Think about it. But it is very clear that the mind is embodied and embedded, maybe not extended. And can we solve the problem of consciousness? The hard problem of consciousness, can we indeed understand how qualia fit in the physical world? Well, at least all the philosophical arguments against them are based on intuitions or on bad reasoning. So we can figure out mind-body relations also with respect to qualia using the natural method, the discovery of the Penfield homunculus being a clear example of that. So we can be hopeful that we also in the future will understand how qualia fit in the physical world, in the rest of the physical world. And we need to look at the brain, of course. So materialism is really the only option in the debate. Which version, identity theory, connectionism, combined with the embodied and embedded theory of the mind. If you do the brain immorality course I give together with Herman de Recht next year in the cognitive neuroscience track, then we have an argument that actually says that identity theory and connectionism are not different, that connectionism is just a version of identity theory. That's an elaborate argument, but I think that is something you could do. So that means that we need to study the embodied and embedded brain if we want to know more about the mind as well. So I hope you enjoy the second part of this course, which is all about the brain. That's it for lecture 7. Stay safe.